Is this going to be one of those we're overpopulated videos? Yeah, we're going to find out. This has been the case with a lot of friends of mine, is that I think that a lot of people don't want to have kids anymore, and the reason why is because of money. I think that is the main reason, and there's other reasons too, but that's the main reason.
The US fertility rate drops to another historic low.
Ooh.
Births in Japan hit record low.
Ooh.
Italy's national birth rate is declared a national emergency. Nearly every country is due to shrink by 2100. There's little to no doubt that there's like an ongoing fertility crisis. People are choosing to not have babies anymore. From South Korea to the United States to Norway to Taiwan, pretty much every rich country. And you might not think this is a problem, but it is a problem for a few reasons. The reality is that people are living longer than ever at the moment.
Yep.
When people start to live this long, you need new workers to replace the ones that are retiring. You need new workers to pay taxes that will eventually fund the pensions of those who retire. And you need young people in the workforce to take care of those older people. In the 1960s, there were 6 people of working age for every retired person. And by 2035, it's expected to be 2 to 1. This is one of those topics where if you ask 5 different people, you'll get 5 completely different answers as to what the reason is.
I think that all the reasons, it's like you can look at different branches, but it all comes from the same tree, which is financial uncertainty. I think that's the main reason. Like, there's other social reasons too, but I think that that's the main thing.
People tend to have quite strong opinions. Some people might say it's a cost of living issue. Some people might say that it's to do with declining rates of religion.
That's probably true.
Some people might blame women's liberation movements, for example. Either way, no matter what people say, they're typically pretty certain that either their experience or their belief is the reason why on a global scale people aren't having children. I think we can do better than that, because when I see that there's a problem that is affecting Norway, the US, Taiwan, and France, I tell myself that there's got to be like a better answer that we can give, right? Because these countries are completely different. The childcare situation, for example, in Norway is vastly different to the childcare situation in the US, which is vastly different to the UK. So I feel like we can get a better answer than just this one line solution of, oh, it's the cost of living. I think we can do better. If you asked me, to be honest, like even just a couple of weeks ago, I would have put the blame squarely on the cost of housing. In fact, there's this one chart that lives like in my head.
That's the way I think of it. I think it's because people don't have the money. At least that's the ones that I know here. That's the reason why.
Rent-free. It's a chart that compares the growth of house prices to the growth of incomes in the UK. And intuitively, to me, it feels like that's why people wouldn't want to have kids.
Yeah, of course.
And to a lot of people, it feels that way.
That's the way I see it.
I want to challenge my intuition, and maybe we can reach a more nuanced answer as to why this is more of a global problem than necessarily a specific localized problem. For example, this is a piece of research from the US, which tried to establish what the effect of a $10,000 increase in housing would be on people's decision to have kids. Unsurprisingly, if house prices go up, it corresponds to a 2.4% drop in the decision to have kids if you are renting. However, if you own your home, you actually become more likely to have kids as house prices go up. The net effect of this is that when house prices go up in the US,
how's that
more
even make
people
sense?
actually want to have kids, which is really counterintuitive.
Yeah,
there is some
doesn't make
variance
sense. How?
because in the UK, the effect of increasing house prices is a net decrease. And this is just one piece of evidence that immediately helps us understand that we can't just think of this problem as a one-line solution. Clearly, housing can't explain the full picture. I think the cost of having children is another huge factor that people typically fall back on when they explain the reasons why people aren't having kids. It's too expensive. However, it seems that even paying people to have kids isn't working very well. Taiwan spent more than $3 billion trying to get its citizens to have more children, and it's had no success at all. In France, they've spent even more money, about 4% of their GDP, on various measures to encourage people to have children. To put this into perspective, if the US spent 4% of its GDP on family measures, that would be the equivalent of the entire defense budget. So countries are actually, some countries at least, are actually spending a huge amount of money on things like tax breaks, things like direct cash transfers, and things like childcare benefits to encourage people to have kids. So clearly there's a bit more to this whole situation than meets the eye initially. And I think we can maybe look at some of the research and evidence, because there is a whole body of research and evidence to engage with.
What the fuck?
And I've tried to find the best bits to share it with you. And I'm curious to hear what your opinions are on these
All right, let's
different
see
aspects. What I do find really interesting is like how the narrative has changed around this topic, because a couple of decades ago, overpopulation was all the rage. All of the discussion around the number of people on Earth revolved around the fact that there were too many people. And we have two people to blame for this. First of all, we have this dude here. His name is Thomas Malthus, and he is an 18th century economist. And he was the first major figure to really write about this idea of a population boom. He saw that the quality of life in 18th century England was dropping pretty quickly. And he said that there was just too many people and that we'd get to a point where there wouldn't be enough food to sustain the growing population. And a couple of decades later, another professor wrote about the same topic. His name was Paul Ehrlich, and he wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And people really believed them. To kind of put into perspective how scared people were of overpopulation, I want to share a quote by the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the US, who said that overpopulation could be more explosive than the atomic or hydrogen bomb. Even on the other side of the world, in China, these
they used to have the one-kid policy.
Promoted China's decision
to that for years.
Implement their one-child policy. The whole package of laws and regulations designed to stop Chinese people from having more than one child. If we fast forward to today, those fears were like clearly unfounded. I think most of us understand that food insecurity is a distribution problem and not an agriculture problem. And instead, we've ended up in the situation where underpopulation is the problem, where there are not enough young people. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the US specifically, because I think they've got some really interesting factors that paint a different picture of the fertility crisis to the one that you might have in your head at the moment. This is a graph of the US fertility rates, and it's the kind of graph that makes you want to jump to a specific conclusion or a one-line answer as to what's going on here. But the real interesting part of this graph isn't what it looks like now. It's what it looks like when you kind of break it down by demographics. And thankfully, The Economist has done this for me. If we look at birth rate divided by age, we see some really interesting trends. Somewhat surprisingly, the fertility rate amongst women over 30 has actually been steadily rising since the 1990s. However, you might see something else that's quite interesting. Birth rates amongst 15 to 19-year-old women in the US dropped dramatically. The actual figure is 77%. And
that's probably a good thing. Yeah, because I know people that had kids in high school and it fucked their life up. Yeah, I'd say that definitely is a good thing. I'd say so. I feel like maybe what's happening is like, because you look at like France, Italy, Japan, like the US, I feel like these are all very developed countries, and I'm not sure like what it's like in those other countries, but there's been a conversation about things called like third spaces where people go to interact with other people. Like, for example, a card shop, a skate park, a shopping mall, or something like that. And now I think that people don't really do that as much. So maybe it's because people aren't interacting with the opposite sex at all. Like, yeah, the arcade, right? Because it's like, when do you really interact with girls? Like, a real question, right? If you're a young person, when do you interact with girls? At work? Yeah, and so, like, never, right? Naturally, right? This is the Asmongold stream, so the answer is never. Yeah, but, like, at work, well, at work, it's totally different, right? Like, it's a totally different dynamic, totally different vibe. So, it's like work or school. So, like, outside of work or school, when are you interacting with them? Probably fucking never. And I think that's probably a big reason, too. It's a huge reason.
He explained that more than half of the drop in America's total fertility rate is driven by women under 19 choosing to no longer have kids. Around a third of these births would have been unplanned, and the majority of these births would have been on low incomes as well. In the UK, we actually see a similar trend where women at age 20 are having half as many children. Unlike richer women, these young women are not going to compensate by having more kids in the future. And I actually want to like take a brief second to have a little aside and talk about the fact that often the most vilified group of people are actually the most important group of people to society. I'm sure you've heard young single mothers described as a burden on society or as lazy. But clearly these women were
The problem is not the young single mothers. The problem is that the fathers of the kids that the young single mothers have don't take accountability for the kid, and they don't help raise the kid. That's the actual problem. People have been having kids at 19 for like, because you've got to keep in mind, like, people have been having kids at like 16 to 19 years old for 99.999% of the history of humankind. This isn't like some kind of fucking like weird thing that it happens. This is the norm. It is. And both parties are to blame. Even lower than 16. Yeah, to be honest with you, even lower than 16, right? It gets into some weird conversation, so I don't want to get too far into that. But it's definitely fucking true, right? You look at history, that's what history says. And so it makes sense that this happens. But the problem isn't necessarily that they're having kids when they're young. The problem is that the fathers are not taking care of the kids. That's where the issue is. That's the real problem.
Like the backbone of the economy. It's an aspect that I feel
not
many
true.
people don't actually think about.
I think it is.
Obviously, it would be unreasonable to say that the reason that no one is having kids is purely because teen pregnancies are down. The economic aspect of it is clearly like important. It's clearly relevant. I don't think it's a coincidence if you look in this graph that the countries that have the lowest fertility rate in Europe, countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece, are also the countries with the highest youth unemployment, the countries where young people live with their parents for the longest, and the economy is in the bin, basically.
Yeah.
And if you just ask young adults why they're not having kids, a lot of them will say that it's simply because childcare is too expensive. What I do find interesting, though, is that the fertility crisis is one that affects the whole world. And it affects countries that spend an incredible amount of money on social programs for kids. So this is a quote by Robert Reich. If you don't know who Robert Reich is, he was...
This isn't fully true. Studies show the only thing that matters is the number of caretakers, not their sex. Well, yeah, but if that number is 2, it's better than 1. Regardless, right? And I think that's the point that I'm making, right? Is that, like, for a lot of the people that I know that had kids really young, they don't really take care of the kids. Like, I feel like that's pretty simple, like, that's bad. I don't know if I agree with a lot of this. I'm 33, I have 2 kids, 1 more on the way. I just don't have a degree or my own house, 2 cars, I run my own eBay shop. I personally think it's just people. Yeah, but why do people do that, though, is the question.
US Secretary of Labor. He says that Norway spends around $30,000 per child on early childhood care. Finland spends $23,000. Germany spends $18,000. And the US spends $500 per child.
Guys, I found out, I think there's a way that we can save $500. Holy shit. We could be sending that money to Israel and we're saying that we're spending it on the kids? Bro, what the fuck? What are we doing?
Obviously, the US has a huge childcare spending problem. It just doesn't want to invest in young children. But Norway, which is spending incredible amounts on early childhood care, is still seeing a below replacement birth rate. Ooh. And when we talk about this problem, we tend to lump men and women in together as if their experience of having children is identical, when there are actually some pretty significant differences that can at least help us explain some more of the trend towards choosing to not have children. And one of these big factors is the fact that women's earnings drop significantly after having a child. And that drop persists decades after they have children. This is not so much of a problem.
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, that's the wage gap. Yeah, this is the real wage gap. It's not, oh, women are being paid less because they're women. No, it's because they have kids. That's the reason why it happens. It's simply unfair. Well, do you know what's unfair? Biology. Biology is unfair. That's the way the world works. Like, if you're mad about that, you're unhappy about this, that's okay. You can be mad. But I didn't decide this. I didn't make it like this. This is just the way the world works. So, and I think this is why, like, this is, remember what I said before about how, like, marriage isn't for a man or a woman, it's for the kid? I think this is another good example of that. I don't see the problem here. Less people is generally good. In what capacity, right? Serious question. Why do you think everyone's mad? Oh, I don't know. I mean, are people mad? I have no idea.
For men who choose to have kids don't earn significantly less than men who don't choose to have kids. And they don't also experience a short-term drop in the amount that they earn. Gender-based differences in terms of the experience of childcare, I think are a remarkably important factor.
Of course.
Because ultimately, you need 2 people to have a child. This tracks with the work of Dr. Matthias Dupke. He's like the guy to talk about family economics. It's his like area of specialty. He talks at length about the differences between low fertility countries and ultra low fertility countries. In the countries that have the lowest levels of fertility, there is a clear trend of women taking on a greater percentage of the burden of childcare.
Yeah.
So in the really low fertility countries, the percentage of childcare duties that is taken on by women can be as high as 80%. In countries that have slightly better fertility ratios, this percentage is much closer to 50-50. There's still a huge stigma in some of these countries, particularly South Korea and Japan, where women are still expected to spend huge amounts of time at home taking care of children, but they can't survive without having a career, or they simply just want a career, which is also very reasonable. The decision to have kids is, in some extent, a signal of optimism, right? A signal in the belief that you'll have a good future, your kid will have a good future, and the world on the whole.
I don't know about before, like it's something that has to do with like the kids that are feeling that way, or sorry, parents that are feeling like their kid's going to be born into like a bad world. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen a whole lot. I mean, I'm sure it happens sometimes, though. I'm sure it's a factor, but I feel like the main reason why, I mean, I don't know. I think that he's right that it's probably more complicated than what I said about being just money, though. It's probably a combination of things, but all I'm saying is that I think the fact that like a lot of dads, like, you know, there's a reason why there's the meme of, you know, dad went out to get cigarettes and he didn't come back for 20 years. Like that meme isn't really a good meme, is it? That's kind of a bad meme. And so, yeah. What about high abortion rates? Yeah, I think abortion rates probably do play a role in it too, for sure. Nuclear families destroyed. Yeah, well, it's because people don't get married in the same way, I think. I think that's another factor. It's probably like, the more I think about this, it's probably like 5 things that come together that like make a, you know, like a perfect storm, right? Rather than like one specific thing that causes it to happen.
Has a good future ahead of it. And I think these disparate factors all play into a single idea of optimism about the world. There's a really good research group called Our World in Data. They're amazing. They compiled some data on how optimistic people feel about the world. And you can see that there's this concentration of rich, low fertility countries at the bottom of this graph. And I think it helps us at least explain somewhat why the countries that are even trialing just direct one-off cash payments are not seeing remarkable improvement. Giving someone a one-off payment doesn't necessarily make them feel like the world is going to be a better place in the next 5, 10, 15 years. On the other hand, places like Taiwan have tried extended maternity leave, and that hasn't worked because that has actually increased the risk for women. They're going to be out of the workforce for longer, and they're going to struggle to recover the income that they once had.
Well, like if you're thinking about it from a job POV, like why are you going to want to have a girl there that's pregnant working at a job if she's going to have to leave for like 2 months? You know, I mean, just think about it that simple. Yeah, of course that's what's going to happen. Yeah, I mean, it's common sense. That's the way they'd see it. More like a year, maybe. I mean, like 2 years. Well, I don't know. I know that like some women get back to work kind of soon, maybe 2 months. I'm not sure, right? I could be wrong. I've heard from other people that maternity leave, at least here, is like sometimes only 2 months.
These macro factors like the gender wage gap, which are kind of creating like a negative pressure, and it's not enough to balance that negative pressure. But importantly, it's also worth mentioning that
3.
a lot of the drop in fertility is actually a good thing. It represents that people have agency. People can actually choose whether or not to have children, especially women. In fact, we use the term fertility crisis when it's not really a fertility crisis. It's a worker crisis. Governments aren't trying to create self-actualized, happy, positive individuals. They're trying to create meat for the grinder.
That's true. That's a good point. Yeah. No, he's right about that. I feel like this is a good video. I mean, I didn't know some of this stuff in this video. And I think that you're right. It's probably something that's like 2 years. What the fuck? It's 2 or 3 months. I don't know, right? I mean, I'm not going to get back and forth about it. But the point is that I feel like it is money, a big factor. I think the biggest factor here is money. But I think, and there's the video. That was a really, really good one. And people rely on the government too much. Yeah, but like it's the fact that like people don't take accountability for their kids. they have kids and then they peace out, and then like the mom is stuck with the kids, so then she doesn't want to have the kid because the guy isn't going to stick around to help them. I mean, fuck, man. Like, that's money was never the problem. It's an excuse. I think that it's all a lot. I think it's a lot of reasons. It's also the fact that, like, as a young guy, like, where can you go to interact with other girls? You can go to, like, a club, maybe, but, like, those are super expensive, and you have to pay money to get into those. It's a culture problem. Yeah. It's like, it's amalgamation of issues. Yeah, I think it's like 5 or 6 different things at the same time, right? The gym or the bar. Yeah, exactly, right? It's harder to do that. And I feel like there's not that same, like, you know, multi-gender, like, shared spaces that we used to have. He's talking about population. There's already too many people around. Population growth is only needed for unsustained growth models, which can't be realistic anyway. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just saying, like, it's pretty clear that the population going down massively is bad. Why not make companies opt for working home, facilitate mothers, or bring their children to work for the first 2 or 3 years? I don't know. I think there's a lot more to it than that. The rhetoric devalues people, so more and more people don't treat others for being valuable. That's hot might. You can go to college parties. It works for me. Yeah, but then you, like, what I mean by shared spaces are things that you do that aren't attached to your work or your job. Or, sorry, your work or your school. So, like, non-school, non-work things. That's what I'm really kind of talking about. And I don't think there's as many of those as there used to be. And the ones that there are, third places, yeah, that's really what they're referred to. And the ones that do exist are usually like, they're like kind of random in a way, right? Or like they're mainly guys, right? Or mainly women or something like that. And you have to pay to get into them. Oh, to your church? Yeah, exactly, church, right? And like church attendance is going down. So it's like religion, I think, does play a part, like indirectly and directly. So yeah, society asking why I'm asking not having kids is like my boss asking me why I'm so poor. Yeah, comfort of the rich depends on an abundant supply of the poor. True. And people can't afford food, a house, a car, medicine. How can they afford to have a kid? Yeah, there you go. This term fertility crisis is bullshit. It's really a worker shortage. Cuts a lot of the crap. Yeah, it's probably a good point too. Yeah, it's not really a fertility crisis. It's a worker shortage. It's all down to women's education. This all started when women started getting jobs. Yep, that's where we went wrong, guys. I guess so. Man, I can't even afford a place to live. How could I possibly afford a child? See, that's the way that I see a lot of it, right? I'm not producing the next generation of laborers and stockholders just because they want to. Yeah, I guess so. And we're just dying off. Not a worker shortage. It's a job shortage. Well, I don't know. I don't think he's wrong, though. I'm not sure. I'd have to look and see. But I did see... I could easily see like how that would happen. Sure. Do you think modern sex culture plays a role? Yeah. I think people like the hookup culture and like the fact that you can do online dating and everything. I think absolutely that makes it to where like you feel like you have more options than you naturally would. I think that's absolutely true. It's not even a question. I think something interesting is look at divorce rates around the world and how long relationships tend to last. Surely that contributes to how realistic having a kid is to some people. Yeah, I think that's a factor too. Back in the 50s, people didn't necessarily have more money, but they had more living space. I think also, it's like the culture was totally different. Like, everything was different back then. You can't look at, like, you know, a one-to-one because there's so much different stuff. I'll be right back.